The wine glass shattered on the marble floor of Lucien's, and the entire dining room turned to look, not at the glass, at the man standing over it. Marcus Webb stood perfectly still, a white towel over his forearm, the dark stain of Cabernet spreading across the toe of his black shoes. He did not apologize immediately. He was looking, very briefly, at something across the room that had nothing to do with the glass. The woman seated at table 14 did not have that patience. "Are you serious? Right now?" Renata Voss said loud enough for 3 surrounding tables to hear. "Do you have any idea who I am? Get a manager now. This is the 3rd mistake tonight." It had been the first mistake. Marcus did not correct her. He cleaned the glass. He apologized with the flat, practiced courtesy of a man who had absorbed worse than this, and would absorb it again before the night was over. He did not tell her that he had only dropped the glass because, 4 seconds earlier, he had identified an account. Unregistered earpiece transmission pattern in the security detail standing at the restaurant's rear entrance minus a detail that in his other life, would have ended a contract review meeting early. He did not tell her that 2 of the 4 men in that security detail had 11 months earlier, sat in a classroom he taught. He simply said, "My apologies, ma'am. I'll have someone bring a replacement immediately," and walked back toward the kitchen with wine soaking into his shoe. 40 minutes later, when the lights in the dining room dropped without warning and every exit door locked simultaneously, the 2 men from Renata Voss's security detail would do something that confused her more than the blackout itself. They would turn, in perfect unison, and look directly at the waiter. To understand what happened in the dark at Lucien's that night, you have to understand what nobody in that dining room minus including Renata Voss, including her own security team, including the restaurant's owner, who had hired him 8 months earlier without checking much beyond his references, minus actually knew about the man clearing tables, in a black vest and a borrowed pair of dress shoes. Marcus Webb had spent 19 years in the United States Army. The final 11 of them in a Special Forces detachment whose name appeared in almost no public records, and whose actual work appeared in none. He had served in postings that he would later, in the rare moments he discussed any of it, refer to only by region and never by operation. He had been trained, and had eventually become responsible for training others. In a discipline that sat at the precise intersection of 2 skill sets, that rarely existed in the same person at a high level, close-quarters combat effectiveness, and the considerably rarer ability to teach it to other highly capable people in a way that actually stuck under pressure. In his final 4 years of service, Marcus had run the Advanced Close Protection curriculum for a joint training program that selected candidates from across multiple agencies and military branches, minus the kind of program where attendance alone functioned as a credential, and where Marcus's name, among the small community of people who would eventually staff the protection details of corporations, foreign officials, and high-net-worth families, carried a specific and substantial weight. He retired at 41. Not from injury, not from any single dramatic event, but from the accumulated calculation that 19 years of being away minus for training cycles, for deployments, for the unpredictable demands of a career that did not respect school plays or parent-teacher conferences, minus had cost him more of his daughter's childhood than he was willing to keep paying. His wife Diane had held the family together through all of it with a strength Marcus never stopped being aware of. When she was diagnosed with early onset ovarian cancer 18 months after his retirement, the diagnosis, arriving with the particular cruelty of timing that makes already difficult things feel almost personally targeted, Marcus did not hesitate about what came next. He stepped back from every consulting opportunity his reputation could have easily generated minus, and there were many. The kind that paid extraordinarily well for exactly the expertise he had spent 2 decades building minus, and became full-time, the person managing his wife's care and his daughter's stability through 14 months that ended despite everything modern oncology and Marcus's relentless advocacy could provide, with Diane's death 3 weeks after their daughter's 10th birthday. Sophie Webb was 11 years old now. Quiet in the specific way that children become quiet after losing a parent too early minus not withdrawn. Exactly, but carrying an awareness of fragility that most children her age did not yet have to carry. Marcus had rebuilt their life around her in the 18 months since Diane's death with the same disciplined attention he had once brought to training programs that prepared people to protect heads of state. He did not take consulting work that required travel. He did not take anything that risked the kind of unpredictable hours that had once defined his career. He needed steady, local evening shift work that let him be home every morning to get Sophie to school, and every afternoon to be there when she returned. A restaurant job did that. The pay was modest. The work was, compared to nearly everything else in Marcus's professional history, almost absurdly simple. But it let him sleep in his own house every night and be present for a daughter who had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and Marcus had decided, with the same clear-eyed discipline that had once made him exceptional at his actual profession, that nothing about his pride needed protecting more than that. He told almost no one at Lucien's about his background. Not from shame. Marcus did not experience anything close to shame about the work he had once done, but because explaining it inevitably led to questions, and curiosity, and a version of workplace attention that complicated the only thing he actually needed from this job: quiet, steady hours that let him go home to Sophie. The restaurant's owner, a careful and somewhat overwhelmed man named Felix Tran, knew only that Marcus's military references had been unusually strong, and that he had never, in 8 months, needed to be told anything twice. Renata Voss was 46 years old, the chief executive of Voss Industrial Holdings, a manufacturing and logistics conglomerate her father had built, and that she had over the past decade expanded aggressively into international markets that came with a correspondingly aggressive set of personal security requirements. She traveled with a 4-person close protection detail wherever her schedule required public appearances, dinners with potential partners, or the kind of high-visibility social events where her presence functioned as much as a business signal as a personal choice. She had grown, over the years, accustomed to a specific quality of attention from the people around her, minus the deference that accumulates around someone whose decisions affect thousands of jobs and billions in revenue, and she had developed, alongside that accustomed deference, a correspondingly thin tolerance for anything that disrupted the smoothness she expected from every interaction in her orbit. She was not, by the account of people who worked closely with her, a cruel person in any sustained sense. She was, more precisely, someone who had stopped noticing the people whose job was to make her evening seamless. In the specific way that sustained privilege sometimes erodes a person's awareness of who is actually in the room with them. The dinner that evening was a business meeting disguised as a social occasion, minus Renata hosting 2 potential partners for a logistics expansion deal worth, depending on final terms, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. The stakes were real. Renata's attention, understandably, was almost entirely consumed by the conversation across the table, which meant that everything else happening around her, minus the service, the staff, the careful choreography that kept a restaurant of this caliber running invisibly, registered with her only when something went wrong. The wine glass was the third small irritation of the evening, though it was in objective fact the first actual mistake, minus the previous 2 mistakes Renata had referenced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear had been a slightly delayed course, and a sommelier recommendation she had disagreed with, neither of which constituted an error in any meaningful sense. When Marcus's hand brushed the glass while clearing an adjacent setting, distracted, for less than 2 seconds, by the earpiece anomaly he had identified near the rear entrance, and it tipped and shattered against the marble. Renata's reaction arrived with the full accumulated frustration of a stressful negotiation rather than the proportionate response to a dropped glass. "Are you serious right now? Do you have any idea who I am? Get a manager." Now this is the 3rd mistake tonight. The dining room had gone quiet enough that the words carried to at least 6 surrounding tables. Marcus knelt and began collecting the larger glass fragments onto his serving tray, with the same economical, unhurried precision he brought to everything. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression carried nothing that could be read as resentment or embarrassment, minus only the flat professional composure of someone who had, across 2 very different careers, developed an unusually high threshold for what counted as a difficult moment. "My apologies, Mom," he said, I'll have someone bring a replacement immediately. He did not mention what he had actually been looking at. He did not mention that the rear entrance security personnel, minus Renata's own protection detail, positioned there as part of standard event security protocol minus had 11 months earlier been students in an advanced close protection course Marcus had personally taught, and that the earpiece transmission pattern he'd noticed carried a delay signature inconsistent with their standard equipment, the kind of inconsistency that, in his former professional life, would have warranted an immediate equipment check rather than continued silence. He simply finished clearing the fragments, stood, and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving a faint trail of Cabernet from his soaked shoe. Renata returned her attention to her business partners with the particular efficiency of someone who had already filed the incident away, as resolved and unimportant. She had no way of knowing that the night's actual significant event had not yet begun. At 9:47 p.m., the lighting throughout Lucien's main dining room dropped to emergency levels without warning, and a low mechanical tone sounded from the building's access control panel near the host stand minus the specific tone, audible to anyone trained to recognize it, that indicated a centralized lockdown of every exterior door. The restaurant's general manager, standing near the host stand, looked at the panel with confused alarm. The panel showed no fire alert, no smoke detection, nothing in the standard emergency categories that would explain a full lockdown, just a flashing red indicator reading security override minus external. What had actually happened minus information that would not become clear to most of the people in that dining room, until considerably later minus was that Lucien's building management system, the same category of smart infrastructure increasingly common in high-end commercial properties, had been remotely accessed by an unauthorized party roughly 6 minutes earlier. The access was not random. The restaurant's reservation system, visible to anyone who had compromised the network, showed Renata Voss's table booking under her company's corporate account, complete with the specific table location and the standard notation, indicating a 4-person executive protection detail in attendance minus the kind of detail that to the wrong person signaled exactly the combination of high-value target and predictable location that made an opportunity worth pursuing. The lockdown was not the attack itself. It was the precursor, minus a deliberate isolation of the room, sealing every standard exit, creating a contained environment before the actual intrusion attempt began through the building's service corridor, the one route that the compromised access system had specifically left unlocked. In the sudden dark and confusion, most of the dining room's response was what anyone would expect: startled voices, the scrape of chairs, phones lighting up as people reached for flashlight functions, a rising murmur of confusion shading quickly toward concern. Renata's 2 visible security personnel, minus the men stationed near her table minus, did something different. They did not reach for their phones. They did not look toward the host stand for explanation. They turned in the same fraction of a second toward the kitchen doors. Toward Marcus. Marcus had been in the kitchen service corridor when the lights dropped, already moving before the lockdown tone finished sounding minus, not because he had advanced knowledge of what was about to happen, but because the earpiece anomaly he had clocked 90 minutes earlier had been sitting at the edge of his attention all evening. The specific kind of low-grade vigilance that 19 years of training had made permanently quietly automatic, regardless of what job title currently appeared on his paycheck. He moved through the dark kitchen, with the unhesitating confidence of someone who had mapped every exit and choke point in this building during his first shift 8 months earlier. An old habit so deeply ingrained that Marcus had performed it without consciously deciding to, the way some people instinctively note the nearest emergency exit in any unfamiliar room. He reached the service corridor, connecting the kitchen to the restaurant's rear loading area, in under 15 seconds. There were 2 intruders, moving with the controlled, practiced efficiency of people who had planned this carefully and were not first-timers minus professional, focused, working toward the dining room. With the specific economy of motion that told Marcus, within 2 seconds of visual contact, almost everything he needed to know about the level of threat he was dealing with. What followed lasted, by the building's restored security footage, later reviewed by law enforcement, 14 seconds. Marcus did not announce himself. He did not give a warning that would cost him the only advantage the dark and his familiarity with the space provided. He moved with the specific, economical violence of someone who had spent 2 decades training other people to do exactly this, and who had in 11 years of teaching it, never once stopped being better at it himself than any student who passed through his program. The first intruder was down before he fully registered Marcus's presence. The second, reacting faster, got half a turn, and one defensive motion in before the same controlled efficiency ended his participation in whatever the evening had been planned to become. Marcus secured, both of them, recovered a tactical radio one of them had been carrying, and was speaking into it calm, clipped, professional to whoever was monitoring the other end, identifying himself only by a designation that meant nothing to anyone in that restaurant except eventually, to the 2 men who would arrive on the scene as the actual emergency response. By the time the building's power and access systems came back online restored by the same emergency protocols that had ironically been designed by a security consulting firm to prevent exactly this kind of external override. Protocols that took just under 4 minutes to fully engage once the anomaly was detected. Marcus had returned to the dining room. He was no longer wearing the serving vest. He stood near the kitchen entrance, speaking quietly with Renata's 2 security personnel, who were listening to him with the specific, total attention of men receiving instructions from someone whose authority they did not question for a single second. Renata Voss stood near her table in the returning light, her 2 business partners beside her, the dining room around them shifting from confusion to the particular charged quiet of people realizing, gradually, that something serious had happened and concluded, though most of them would not learn the full details until law enforcement statements were taken later that night. She watched her own security detail the 2 men who had, less than an hour earlier, stood at the rear entrance with the relaxed, slightly bored posture of routine duty, now standing with rigid attention in front of the waiter who had dropped a wine glass at her table. "Mitchell," she said, addressing the senior of the 2 men, her voice carrying a confusion that for the first time that evening, had nothing to do with frustration. "What is happening?" Mitchell David Mitchell, 11 years with Renata's protection detail, formerly an Army military police officer before transitioning to private security. Did not immediately answer her. He was still looking at Marcus. "Ma'am," Mitchell said finally, "this is Master Sergeant Webb." The title meant nothing to Renata. It meant a considerable amount to Mitchell, whose voice carried a weight that Renata had genuinely never heard from him before, not in 11 years of routine professional competence. "He ran the advanced close protection course I went through before I was cleared for executive detail work." Mitchell continued, "Both of us did." He gestured slightly toward his colleague, who had not stopped looking at Marcus either. "He's the reason I know how to do this job at the level your insurance requires." Renata looked at Marcus, really looked at him for what was, though she would not have phrased it this way herself, possibly the first time that evening. He stood with the same composed posture he had carried while clearing wine glass fragments off her table, the wine stain still visible on his shoe. "You're the waiter." "Nah," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am tonight." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. She gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, toward the now restored lights, toward the entire chain of events she had only partially witnessed. "What just happened?" Marcus explained it the same way he explained most things, directly, without embellishment, without performing either modesty or significance. Simply laying out what had occurred in the plainest available language. 2 individuals had used a compromised building access system to lock down the dining room and attempt entry through an unsecured service corridor. He had identified and neutralized the threat before it reached the dining room. Law enforcement was now in the building processing the scene. Both individuals were in custody. Renata listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than the silence usually permitted in rooms where she was the most powerful person present. "You work here," she said, "as a waiter." "I do." "Why?" It was in its bluntness, almost the only honest question Renata had asked anyone in months, stripped entirely of the careful diplomatic framing that usually governed her conversations with people whose social position differed from her own. Marcus considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. "My wife passed away 18 months ago," he said. I have an 11-year-old daughter. The work I used to do required hours and travel that aren't compatible with being the only parent she has left. This job lets me be home every morning and every afternoon. That's worth more to me right now than anything else I could be doing." Renata looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, completely unnoticed in the moment, her two security personnel exchanged a glance that contained an entire unspoken conversation about a man whose name they had clearly mentioned to each other, more than once, in the years since they had left his classroom. The story did not stay contained to Lucien's dining room. A retired Special Forces Master Sergeant working as a waiter, who single-handedly neutralized an attempted intrusion, targeting a Fortune 500 CEO was, by any measure, exactly the kind of story that moved quickly through both local news coverage and the considerably smaller, considerably more attentive world of executive protection and corporate security, minus a world where Marcus's name, already known to a specific professional community, now carried a story attached to it that nobody in that community would forget. Felix Tran, the restaurant's owner, learned the full story the same night, from law enforcement rather than from Marcus, who had not volunteered any of it in 8 months of employment, and did not particularly intend to start now. Felix's reaction, once the shock settled, was less about what Marcus had done, and more about a single retroactive realization that the unusually strong military references on Marcus's job application 8 months earlier had been, in retrospect, a significant understatement. Renata Voss called Marcus 2 days later. Not through an assistant, not through a formal channel, minus she called the restaurant directly and asked to speak with him personally, during a shift, which Felix interrupted Marcus's table service to facilitate, partly out of genuine urgency, and partly out of his own considerable curiosity about how this would unfold. "I owe you an apology." "Huh," Renata said, with none of the performed corporate smoothness that usually characterized her communication. "For the wine glass, for how I spoke to you. I didn't know who you were, and I should say minus that shouldn't actually matter. I shouldn't speak to anyone that way, waiter or otherwise. But I want to be honest that knowing who you were, is what made me actually stop and think about it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Apology accepted. I'd like to offer you a position," Renata continued, "head of executive protection for Voss Industrial. Full authority over my personal security program, my family's and our executive teams. The compensation would be minus," she named a figure that exceeded, by a considerable multiple, anything Marcus had earned even at the peak of his pre-retirement consulting opportunities, minus, and the schedule would be built entirely around whatever structure you need for your daughter. "I mean that specifically and not as a courtesy. You design the schedule, I adjust my expectations to fit it, not the other way around." Marcus considered this with the same careful attention he gave every significant decision. "I'd want that in writing," he said. "The schedule terms specifically." "It will be." "Then, I'm interested," Marcus said. "I'd want to meet your current team first. Understand what's already in place before I change anything." "That's exactly what I'd want you to do," Renata said. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in a conference room on the 14th floor of Voss Industrial's headquarters, reviewing a security assessment with the same unhurried, methodical attention he had once brought to advanced close protection curricula, and more recently to clearing tables at Lucien's. His new schedule, exactly as negotiated, ended at 3:30 p.m. on school days. He had been home for Sophie every afternoon for 3 consecutive weeks, a streak that, in the context of his previous career, would once have been almost unimaginable. That evening, at the kitchen table, Sophie worked on a school project while Marcus reviewed documents from his new role, the two of them sharing the comfortable, companionable quiet that had slowly returned to their house in the months since Diane's death, minus not the same as before, never quite the same, but real, and steady, and theirs. "Dad," Sophie said, not looking up from her project, "Mrs. Calloway said there was something on the news about the restaurant. About you." Marcus set down the document he was reading. "There was," he said. "Are you in trouble?" "No," he said. "Something happened at work, and I helped stop it. It worked out okay, better than okay actually. Sophie looked up at him, considering this with the careful seriousness she brought to most things since Diane's death, minus an 11-year-old's particular gravity, the kind that arrives too early and stays a little too long. Is that why you have a new job now? Partly, Marcus said. But the most important part stays the same. I'm still going to be here every morning, every afternoon. That doesn't change. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and returned to her project minus a diorama, Marcus noticed, of a house with two figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small holding hands. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked his document back up and the kitchen settled back into its quiet, ordinary evening minus the same quiet that 3 weeks earlier, in a different building under very different circumstances, two men who had once been his students had recognized instantly, in the dark without a single word needing to be said. Some people spend a career learning to be seen. Marcus had spent his learning something else entirely minus how to do the work correctly, whether anyone was watching or not, and to let that be enough. It had, in the end, turned out to be more than enough.